Hi, I'm Sheera Frenkel. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. Thank you all for joining us here today for our roundtable on the social dilemma, a documentary which really asks the question of whether our addiction to social media is a feature rather than a bug of these platforms. I'm really excited that we have 4 people with us today who took part in this documentary. We have Jeff Orlowski. He is the director of The Social Dilemma. His 2 previous films, Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, both won awards at Sundance. Tristan Harris, co-founder and president of the Center for Humane Technology and a former Google design ethicist. Rashida Richardson, visiting scholar, Rutgers Law School, senior fellow, German Marshall Fund, and former director of policy research at the AI Now Institute. Renee DeResta, research manager at Stanford Internet Observatory, former head of policy at Data for Democracy. And we also are lucky to have with us today ASL interpreter Andrea Luss. Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to start this panel by taking a quick poll for our lovely roundtable here. I'd like you to raise your hand if you think that the thousands of people listening to this roundtable discussion today should go ahead and delete their social media accounts. Just raise your hand up if you think it needs to be deleted.
I know delete's the right question. It's a tough question. It's a dilemma, if you will.
So short of deleting their accounts outright, which I think would be difficult for most people living in today's world, what do you think are the problems that are introduced by social media into our lives, and why people should think twice before having or using social media?
I could just kick things off. And personally, I have stopped using my social media, but I haven't deleted the accounts, and I still feel stuck on that. It's like I still know that there are people that can only reach me through this platform or friendships that I've created there. So I've actively stopped using them, but keep their presence. I think the big realization for me, at least, in talking with the team that we have here today, talking with the countless subjects that we interviewed over the course of making this film, it was really learning some of the hidden intentions behind these platforms that I certainly was completely unaware of. As an average user, I was a very, very heavy social media user, especially during the last election. I mean, checking all the time, kind of. And I didn't fully understand or appreciate the design, the engineering, the techniques, the incentives for what drove them, what got them to be so big, and how they sort of have taken over. They took over my life, and I see them taking over many people's lives. So for me, I think that was one of the biggest realizations, this asymmetry of power and understanding what exactly is hiding on the other side of your screen.
So maybe understanding why you're using social media and understanding what the mechanisms are behind social media, you think is as important as, maybe even cutting down on social media use. Tristan, do you think that if people understand more about how social media companies work, that informs more of their usage?
Yeah, so to answer your question first directly about should we delete social media, I think if you can, absolutely delete it. You don't need it. What's inhumane, and we call ourselves the Center for Humane Technology for a reason, what's inhumane about our current technology infrastructure is that we're forced to rely on and depend on infrastructure that's contaminated or not good for us or not good for the broader social fabric and democracy, and we don't have another choice. That's what's inhumane. If I'm a teenager and I say, wow, I saw The Social Dilemma, and I want to get off Instagram or I want to get off TikTok, but then all of my friends are only on Instagram, I can't even talk to them if I'm not going to be in those text threads with them, right? That's inhumane because they're manipulating our social exclusion. I will feel excluded from my social group if I don't stay on social media. That is an inhumane experience for today's youth. Similarly, for democracy, the fact that these platforms affect you even if you don't use them. And I know we're going to get into some of the broader topics about how this is affecting, we think of this as kind of the climate change of culture, that this is an extractive economy that's racing to the bottom of the brainstem to frack and extract for human attention. And that causes a kind of mass social climate change of culture. It shortens attention spans, it domesticates us into a simpler thinking human, it makes us more irritable, we're more outraged, we're more narcissistic, kids are more depressed, there's more polarization, there's more division. And if that's the new human race, if that's the new human species, we're not going to be able to solve our problems. Moreover, that introduces tremendous danger and violence around the world and destabilizes really important communities. And so it's really much broader than addiction. I think that's the thing that is the hook that gets us all into this conversation, since we're, again, forced to use these technologies so often. And there's nothing wrong with the slab of glass in your pocket. It's business models of systems that are designed inherently to with incentives that are different than the goals for the public good.
Rashida, what do you think? Do you think people should consider maybe lessening their usage?
I think people need to critically engage with the fact that all technologies are tools and there's trade-offs with use. And I think the reason why I had trouble with answering your first question is because I don't use social media, and it's not even because of the film, it's just out of disinterest. And I know I'm very much a minority in that regard. But I think with all of the benefits of these tools as communication technologies, there are inherent trade-offs with them. And also use is not equal for all users, in that some people can benefit greatly from using these technologies, whereas others are more disadvantaged based on how third parties may view that information. And so I think for each individual, you need to think about what are you actually gaining from using this tool and what is being lost by using it, and really make that personal calculation, because I don't think necessarily canceling everything will then return you to some net neutral position in society. But it's really about whether or not you're getting more benefits than deficits from using the tool.
And Renee, where do you fall on this? Have you changed your mind over the years as you've studied social media on how much people should be actually using it and incorporating it into their lives?
Well, I turned off the red dots. That's my my thing. I turned off notifications. I'm really careful about what, when I allow myself to be distracted. I feel that way. One of the things I've really liked with the latest iOS was when it gave you that option to do that right from the screen, made it really easy. Do you want to allow yourself to be pinged this many times by this app? And it's not just social platforms that are sending push notifications. Of course, it's, Apple News is doing it as well. Your grocery app is doing it. You name it, everybody's kind of constantly trying to bring you back. So disrupting that dynamic by just turning off notifications worked pretty well for me.
And I actually want to start with you on this next question, Renee, which is, right now we're in the middle of an incredibly heated election here in the United States. It feels like every day there are headlines about the role that social media has played in feeding certain partisan channels, feeding certain filter bubbles. Do you think that during an election there should be an added sort of awareness or thought about the way that social media is driving conversation and perhaps affecting our democracy?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we're doing at Stanford is we have a consortium effort called the Election Integrity Project. And that's looking just narrowly tailored misinformation about voting specifically. So voting machines, voting processes, when to vote, who votes. And even within that narrowly tailored scope, there's just such a phenomenal amount of narratives that come out and go viral. And people really respond to them depending on whether their kind of trust community, which is the kind of bespoke reality that they've fallen into online, believes or disbelieves the story. And that dynamic is really remarkable to see. We're at a point where, we're all going to go vote for president in 2 months. And the really basic questions around whether particular sources are reputable, or what's happening with the postal service, what's happening with mail-in ballots, what you believe about those things is really subject to what your feed shows you and what groups you're in.
And I want to open it up to the rest of our roundtable here. How have you seen, I'm curious if you've personally noticed ways in which social media has really driven discussion or driven people into certain, highly partisan sort of interpretations of the news based on what they've seen on places like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter.
Yeah, in the trailer of the film, we have that little scene around climate change is. I think this idea was one of the big entrances for me into the story when I realized, wait a second, we have pretty good science, really amazing science on climate change, and yet there is this public disagreement. There are climate deniers. With our past films, with Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, we spent a lot of time talking to people all around the country, all around the world, but especially in the US, we were finding a lot of climate denialism. And there was always this question of why is that there? And so with that particular example and the science that's so robust around it, it always was confusing to us as to why there was such political discord on that particular issue. And this is where we started to see this is a very legitimate reason why that could be the case. If you have a certain filter bubble that you end up in, you're going to get information that reinforces is that. I did with a friend. I took her phone and gave her my phone. And I looked at her Facebook feed and had her look at my Facebook feed. And it was remarkable to see the complete different realities that we were experiencing. Even though we had pretty similar worldviews and pretty similar friends, we had very, very different feeds being fed to us. You just carry that out over years, right? If you're in that decade-long experiment of this is what's being fed to you on a daily basis, and multiple times a day, right? How many times you're checking it is going to keep pushing you down that path. I think it's a very, very real reason why we have the polarization that we do.
When I was watching the trailer just now, I was really caught by that moment about, is climate change real? And I kept thinking, if you could ask that same question and say, is the coronavirus a deadly pandemic? And I think you would get a very similar reaction of quite a few people saying, well, I don't know, it might not be. It might be invented by the government or
Right.
pharmaceutical companies or any number of other conspiratorial claims that have been made online. I'm curious, Rashida, Tristan, how do you think, looking at today's sort of media landscape, social media is driving conversation?
I think it's had a central role in a way that I think is underestimated, because many people seeing the film might say, oh, but haven't we just had very partisan television for a very long time? Or look at radio. Aren't those forces just as influential in steering our public understanding and our public views? But where is the radio and television editors, where are they getting their news from? From Twitter. They're literally sitting on Twitter all day long. And how does Twitter do well in the attention economy when their business model is getting attention? Well, imagine there's two kinds of Twitter. Let's call one personalized Twitter. It's always showing you for people you follow and just what gets clicked the most. And then let's call the other one shared Twitter, like more of a shared conversation about everyone is looking at the same kinds of things. Well, the one that's personalized to you is going to be better for Twitter at getting your attention repeatedly, because personalized attention is just more profitable and it's better for keeping people engaged. What that means is we take this like shared reality and we send it through this mass paper shredder where we all end up in this different reality. As we say in the film, there's 3 billion Truman shows because we all get more affirmation rather than challenging information. And I think that we have to realize this is not a question of if this has happened. This is 100% for sure. We are living in a mass shattered reality. And the real question is, how do we put Humpty Dumpty back together again when we're this far down the train? And I think that the key isn't just that we have to fix how technology works right now. We have to realize that, as Jeff said, we are about 10 years into this massive mind warp. We've been looking in the mirror and saying, hey, we think we're just seeing a reflection of who we are. But we're actually been seeing a funhouse mirror, a mass distortion, where we see the most extreme version of the other side's views that's meant to trigger us because that's what keeps us clicking. And when you say you're 10 years into that process and say, oh my gosh, it's making me, and I think it's making everybody that I know who sees the film, kind of take a step back and say, man, I should really question what's running through my brain, because each of us have been put into this tiny narrow bubble.
And
Rashida?
I'll add to the point Tristan was making about personalization, and that social media often tends to amplify what is known as confirmation bias, and that you're more likely to only want to see the things that confirm your own worldview. But also, I think that has this long-term effect of almost diluting your ability to be critical about the information that you're receiving. So even when individuals are faced to engage with media opinions or information that doesn't conform to their personal view, it's harder not only to comprehend that information, but also critically engage with it as to whether it's true or false, or how you're able to adapt your opinion based on that information. So I also think it has this long-term effect on us as individuals in our own critical thinking and engagement skills in the long run.
I do think that Twitter drives a lot of the conversation, and I think in general, social media does drive a lot of the conversation. And I'm curious whether the panelists have noticed, since the making of this documentary, have you noticed any ways in which that has changed? Has the fact that we're all at home in the middle of a pandemic on our computers, much more probably than we ever have been before, has that amplified some of the things that you really talked about in this film? Jeff?
Yeah, I'm happy to start that one. We first premiered this film at Sundance back in January. And that was the world premiere of the film. And we were getting just the first feedback from the public. And we were figuring out, we were able to partner with Netflix for the release of the film, and we were figuring out the release. And then COVID hit, and everybody started getting locked at home. And we were seeing this complete shift. Fortunately, we were able to edit the film and include a little bit of reference to COVID in the film. But it became all the more clear to us that in a time when we are all on our devices all the time, it is so much more important for us to understand what is at play, what is driving me to these different platforms.
I think for me, one thing that I've been discussing with friends and family is it's almost like we've recognized the loss of what has gone away with the rise of social media. And I think there's been a lot of news coverage on the loss of local media, but I felt it even more at the beginning of the pandemic and during the uprisings, in that I'd had no clue of what was even going on in my own neighborhood without checking Twitter. And mind you, I don't have a Twitter account. And it's because there weren't many other alternatives to understanding what was going on locally, other than like actually talking to neighbors, which I do, and I know many people don't. But it's quite concerning when you realize that traditional mediums for understanding what's going on a hyper local level have dissipated, and you're almost being forced to only rely on these mediums of communication because that's what's left. So I know that there has been more discussion about like the creation of alternatives and what to do so that we don't become overly reliant, or social media is the only way of engaging and knowing what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've personally seen mothers who have turned to social media for the first time in years because they need to find out whether or not their kid's school is going to be open tomorrow, and the only place to get that kind of information is a Facebook channel. Renee, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, zooming out on that writ large, globally, actually, one of the things that we do is we try to understand how people use social media, and that's not only within the US. And coronavirus really turned the entire world to paying attention to one topic. And that was really remarkable because while, conspiracy theories and user-created kind of nonsense from the belly of the internet is a thing that happens with like all pandemics, all outbreaks, I should say. But this is the first time we've seen a real pandemic where the entire world is searching constantly for information, and they're searching on social platforms. They're searching Twitter, they're searching Facebook, they're also searching on Google, of course. And this means that there's this information void where people are looking for something that doesn't yet exist. They're looking for information about a cure when the information about a cure, we just don't know yet. They're looking for information about how they should prepare their children. And what you find in this situation is that even though everyone is looking, what surfaces is just what the platform has available to show you. And so that really brought home for us as researchers studying this, the fact that all of the kind of best laid plans around what you point people to or how to minimize misinformation really kind of fell apart for a while there, as everybody in the world was looking for information and there was nothing to return.
I think to add to what Renee is saying, there's a term in our field called data voids. Data voids are where there's a search query that just because there's a breaking event, it might be something like COVID, I don't even know. There's probably COVID and 5G, right? Before COVID happened, no one had ever searched for the phrase COVID and 5G together. Once that's actually brought up, it creates an incentive for a whole army of people and bad actors to actually rush in and create content for that query and to say, yes, it's absolutely conspiracy theory. And then China will rush in and say, actually, it's not, it's not true. And everyone will kind of create that. And actually a good example of this happening is when this film came out, The Social Dilemma. The day before it came out, people published an article saying, is Tristan Harris married, and what is Tristan Harris's net worth? That post didn't exist until the film came out because they're trying to optimize for stealing search queries. And these are examples of all sorts of ways people try to manipulate it. To your earlier question, I think, back 2 years ago when we recorded, many of the interviews in the film are actually from 2 to 2.5 years ago, and saying things are existential threat or they construct our reality. That seems like an extreme statement. But the more people are actually at home and they're actually stuck at home, you're really reliant. You're staring through these glasses to say, well, what's out there? And those glasses are social media. It's very clear that they are constructing our reality. And, it's one thing when you're in a personalized filter bubble on social media, but you're still running around the world and you've got to go to work and you've got to take your car and you still talk to people and you see things. And, but you have a filter bubble that's through social media. But now when you're at home, that filter bubble is really narrow. You know, a lot of people aren't even, if they have immunocompromised, they're not even talking to their neighbors, they're not going outside. So they're really, really reliant on these systems to construct what is true and what is not true.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I remember, I think it was about 6 months ago now, the pandemic started, and I was on Twitter, which I enjoy, and there was a conversation happening between two journalists, and they were noticing how their screen time had crept up just in the 2 or 3 weeks that they'd been on lockdown. I think one of them, I hope at least that she was joking when she said that her screen time had gone up to 12 hours a day, and she wanted to see if she could up that. She wanted to see if she could break her record of 12 hours a day. And watching this conversation go on, the thread continued over several days, and several other journalists chimed in. It got me thinking that there really was this aspect of becoming more and more addicted. The more time you spent on it, the more time you could almost, you felt yourself drawn to sort of be on it even more. And addiction is obviously something that features so heavily in this film. I'm curious to get your thoughts on, is it appropriate to say that social media is addictive? And if we do use that term with it, in what ways do you think this addiction works? How does it really lure people in?
Well, so this was an area that we really studied at the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab. I don't think addiction is the right term because, first of all, these platforms are fundamental extensions of our lives now. It's almost be like putting a timer on how often am I using my arm, right? Because am I using my arm for 10 hours a day, or am I using it for 6 hours a day? Because I have to use my arm, right? And so when we're stuck at home and we're basically relegated to technology, I don't want to vilify the use of technology by itself. The question is, when I'm using it, do they have my best interests in mind, or are they racing to extract something from me? If you take TikTok, when you launch it, it doesn't even wait for you to click and play a video and choose which video you want. It actually just starts playing the video. When you swipe to the next one, it doesn't wait and say, here, which way do you want to go? It just automatically keeps playing the next video. That's maximizing a hypernormal stimuli, giving you this extra sweet thing you would never find in your evolutionary environment, and constantly giving you those juicy rewards. In fact, there's evidence that TikTok, in order to defeat Instagram, what they did is they said, if a user's on Instagram and they post a photo, they may get this average number of likes and comments, right? So TikTok says, if we want to really addict kids, what we got to do is give you even more likes and more comments per thing. So we're going to try to show it to many more people. So what they actually win in the attention economy by turning each of us into addicts for attention and social feedback from other people. And they're doing this to a whole generation of children. I mean, TikTok is now, I think it's just as big as YouTube, I think, for kids in terms of time spent. And so, we're not just talking about Facebook, even though we repeat that name all the time. It's the entire space, because it's competing for attention. A product that crawls deeper down the brainstem into addiction is going to be more successful than one that just sits there as a tool waiting to be used, which is the distinction that we make in the film. That the key thing that's changed is we've moved from a tools-based technology environment, which is what I grew up with the Macintosh and building things and inventing creative applications and painting and Illustrator and things like that, to a manipulation-based technology environment. And as Jeff said with the example with FaceTime, it's a really interesting example. Like when I FaceTime with Jeff, it doesn't try to show me all the hearts and the likes and the comments and all these things, the people that are chatting in the middle, because it doesn't need to manipulate me. It's not by accident. It's because the incentives are actually aligned with our interests. And I think the key thing that everyone can take away is asking, when I'm using technology, when are these interests of the companies I'm interacting with aligned with me and aligned with us, and when are they not? And that's the key thing we have to change is the broader movement after the film as well.
Jeff,
and to add to that, I agree, Tristan, with your frame there. I think the word addiction, it can mean a lot of different things to different people. But the way I like to look at it is the way we tried to bring it to life in the movie, where put yourself in the perspective of this rational thinking algorithm that is hiding on the other side of your screen, and there's a human over there that you can get money from. And what are your goals? What can you optimize for? I can make more money if I do certain things to the human on the other side of the screen. And they have transformed that into hundreds of billions of dollars of cash value by using these machine learning algorithms to continue to figure out what's going to work on you, what's going to get you to come back, what's going to get you to spend more time here. And so I think thinking through what are the incentives of the system, I wouldn't, that may or may not be considered addiction, but it is really profiting off of the amount of time we spend on the number of devices we spend.
Tristan, you touched on this a little bit, but I think there is an added element both in the film and in real life about how this plays into children specifically, and whether children are more vulnerable to the kind of manipulations that some social media platforms use to keep us engaged as long as possible. And I'm curious if you could speak to specifically how, let's say, minors are affected by social media as opposed to the general population.
Yeah. I know a bit about this, but I'm certainly not as much an expert as someone like Jonathan Haidt or Anna Lemke, who's in the film. I think the key demographic that the film really goes after is 10 to 14-year-old teenage girls. They're highly vulnerable to social approval and identity and being reinforced. We talk about Snapchat body dysmorphia in the film because I think in 2018, 55% of plastic surgeons said that they reported at least one patient who came in wanting to look like their Snapchat. They wanted to get plastic surgery to look like their Snapchat filter, to look, the burstier lips and the bigger cheeks and all of that stuff. Essentially, kids are being taught the lesson. People like you if only you look different than you actually do. Or people like you if only you're living this ideal life that you're not actually living. And that kind of pressure and the forced social exclusion that you're not going to be participating in it if you don't continue is really, really damaging, let alone to say that the developmental and attachment needs of children are very vulnerable. And I think the fact that technology services that attachment need so often, the other reason that I think is not mentioned in the film, why kids go to the hospital is not just because of social media itself, but actually because the phone is taken away. There's lots of reports of kids who really actually have a hard time when that technology is taken away from them because they struggle with, they need to know what their friends are saying. I think all parents are facing this, and I can't imagine in a time of coronavirus when parents have to sit their kids in front of Zoom calls for hours a day. It's different than social media, but just everyone knows the fatigue that this is causing. It's never been more clear the ways that technology is not humane and not designed ergonomically to better fit the true, genuine needs and vulnerabilities of human beings.
What can be done about all of this? I mean, the film raises a lot of concerning problems. It raises a lot of questions about the effects that social media has on all of our lives. And I guess there's a question of who steps in at what point. Is it the onus on us as individuals, obviously, to take control of understanding the role of social media in our lives, understanding how much time we're spending on it, but also is there a role for Washington to play here? Is there a role for regulators, for members of Congress, to perhaps, institute rules and regulations on these companies in terms of what they can really do, how much of our attention they can command, what responsibility they have to their users' security and privacy?
Rashida, go for it.
It has to be both, because I think there, as we discussed earlier on, there are personal decisions individuals can make about their own personal use and benefit of these technologies. But there also needs to be regulation. And I think part of the reason we even got to this space is because of the confluence of two major things. One, generally the tech sector has been or under-regulated, and that's because most of the laws pertaining to the sector were passed almost 3 decades ago. And so they're extremely outdated. But the emergence, especially of the social media field, has emerged after so much dilution of most forms of antitrust regulation and constraints as well. So you're dealing with two primary means of putting some restraints, or at least counterbalancing societal priorities like justice, fairness, with sort of the goals optimized by these technologies, which is monetization. So there's definitely needs to be both. But what is the right balance is, I think, something that we have to grapple with as a society, because we're not, even though the majority of these companies are based here, they're global. And when you're looking at most of the users of these platforms, they're not mostly dominated in Western society. So how do you find the right regulatory approach for communication technologies that have gone sort of unregulated for so long?
Just to add, with the film, we've been working on an impact campaign that is going hand in hand with the film. And that's it's our impact team that has organized today's event. So just a huge thank you to the team. But we've been posing this question: how do we help shift the way the technology is used, the way it's designed, and the way it's regulated? And from our perspective, those are the 3 big levers that we have to be looking at. I think really the silver bullet here is for the tech companies themselves to change from the inside. Like, if there ever was a silver bullet, it was for them to redesign this in a way that is aligned with society's interests, with society's values, with society's needs. Instead of making these products for a commercial purpose, design it for the scale that they've now reached and the responsibility that they have. But if they don't take those proactive steps, I think the only option really is for regulation to come in. And this is where many people are talking about, what does that look like? I think there are still questions around what is the acupuncture point that can really identify this is the way we need to change it and change the system. There are big questions around, what do the laws look like? I think the conversation around anti-regulation is a part of the conversation, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. It doesn't solve the business model. That's as if you're like taking ExxonMobil and just breaking them back up to Exxon and Mobil, and we still have climate change, right? And how do we look at the fundamental underlying mechanisms here? And that's where, from my perspective, and what we share in the film, is this advertising business model that has misaligned the incentives. So I think that's really the conversation that I'm eager to see in Washington, that I want to see more of. And that goes hand in hand with how we treat our data. That goes hand in hand with the responsibilities of the companies. And that's what I'm most excited to have people talk about.
And Tristan, you've obviously been involved for years now in Silicon Valley and trying to put pressure on these companies to change from within. Do you think it's had an effect? Have you seen a change in the time you've been involved?
I would love to see it change from the inside, and there's certainly been many changes that have happened through the inside, but you're not going to get the kind of radical restructuring and changes that we really need without external pressure and regulation, transformative pressure. As Justin says at the end of the film, our systems, our economic systems, prefer profit at all unregulated costs. So in so long as that's true, a whale is worth more dead than alive, and a tree is worth more as $1,000 of 2x4s than as a living tree. A human being is worth more when they're domesticated into a distracted, addicted, irritable, polarized, and disinformed person, because that meant that they were successful at being most manipulatable by advertising. And so what I really worry about is the way that the entire system kind of transforms us as a species into a subversion of ourselves. And what I really hope, if you look at the growth rate of the problem, so looking at this back, Renee has been sounding the alarm on conspiracy theories and Facebook groups since 2014, 2015. We've been really yelling from the rooftops. We're now 5 years into this. If you look at the growth rate of just how bad these problems are growing and how much change have we seen from the industry, we've seen very linear change, and we've seen very exponential growth in the problems, especially as they're happening around the world and driving us all crazy. So I think that what I really hope for the film is it catalyzes a more cultural movement. Culture doesn't usually move very fast, but the film can catalyze a global response that I think is unique to this time, and the fact that the film was released on Netflix in 190 countries in close to 30 languages. Because I think, if you just step back to January, if we were talking about releasing this film in theaters, you'd have people seeing it in theaters and going out to dinner afterwards at a restaurant, versus a world where everyone is trapped at home. Everyone's Netflix users and subscribers have went up by 15 to 20%, and viewership of documentaries has gone up by a tremendous amount. So this is actually created. I used to feel tremendously, I'll be honest, I think anxious and kind of powerless about some of these things, and saying, I don't know if this is going to change. But the first time that I felt optimistic is after this film has come out, and in every country, every language, people are just, flooding in messages saying, I thought I was alone in seeing this. I thought I was alone in feeling that something wasn't right. And this film, I think, is validating the concerns that many people have had, that this has been driving us crazy as a society. And that's why I think something like, this is kind of a silent spring moment for the tech industry.
And Renee, you've been involved in briefing members of Congress for years now. Do you think that there is regulation coming? Do you think that this Congress, or perhaps the new Congress we'll be seeing coming in, is capable of the kind of regulation that's necessary?
Well, one of the challenges is nobody really has decided what the specific thing they want to regulate is. So there's a lot of this, we need to regulate something. And if you ask Republicans or Democrat versus Republican takes on something like content moderation, which has become a huge hot topic, particularly as the president's tweets are being labeled and certain accounts are coming down. One of the main kind of calls to regulate the tech industry has really come around this idea that freedom of expression is being, squashed and mass censorship is happening. And so the challenge is actually, even though both sides are giving the regulate tech, the call to regulate tech. You have conservatives who want to regulate it because they think that it is taking down too much and disproportionately censoring conservatives. And then you have liberals who think that it is not taking down enough. And so, and that hate speech is being allowed to stay up, and certain types of content that they think are inappropriate or targeting marginalized groups are being allowed to stay up. And so that dynamic means that even though there are these, there is a kind of bipartisan call to regulate, that doesn't mean that there's actually any agreement on what the regulation would look like. You've also seen the president put out executive orders that really have no teeth and aren't really rooted in reality. They're more kind of political theater. And so the dynamic of, will something come out? I don't think we have a very nuanced, or we don't even have agreement on what the basic problem to craft the regulation around is. So I think you're probably more likely to see state level regulation, perhaps something out of California, as we saw from California GDPR, or some of the other efforts that that states have made to try to think about the problem and impact it themselves.
In a moment, I'm going to go to some questions that we got from viewers, but first I want to just end on what do each of you hope to accomplish with this film? What do you hope to get out of it? Jeff, you spoke a little bit about the impact campaign, hoping you can talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, our campaign really is focusing on how far can we take this film and how this can shift society. We have a bunch of tools and resources on our website, thesocialdilemma.com, that people can go to help in their individual experiences. I sort of look at it as like there's a personal defense and like protect your own brain, protect your own family, protect your close friends. There's a friends don't let friends use social media mindset that I've been thinking through. Also that like swap your phone with somebody that you might disagree with. And how can this be a personal anecdote in some way, a personal, a wake-up call for us individually and scale that out over society. We end the film with an ask to have a discussion about this, for people to talk about this. And I think that's really, in some ways, the most important thing. We need to have a societal conversation, identify the problem, define the problem, and then we can work as a society to address it and solve it.
Yeah, I mean, I to mirror what Jeff said, the most powerful thing that people can do is to host a screening of the film with people who probably wouldn't see it, and to have a conversation about it. One of the lines in the film from Chamath, the VP of growth at Facebook, who says, how did we hook you? How did we know when we could get a user addicted to Facebook? It was through getting you to 7 friends in 10 days. Once we got you to 7 friends in 10 days, basically we had you for life. So one of the kind of possible messages here is if everybody who sees the film also got 7 other friends to see it, they hosted a second screening, and people are actually enjoying seeing the film a second time, and then watch the film and have a conversation afterwards, and especially do that reality swap that Jeff is talking about. It's sort of like Freaky Friday, like step into my meat suit, step into my reality, and see how would it be that I would be believing these things if you were like living in my shoes. And I think, I might, if you look into my newsfeed, it's kind of a climate change dystopia and escalating US-China tensions. And you might say, oh my gosh, I get why Tristan looks so anxious all the time. And I think that each of us can learn a lot about each other's experiences by swapping realities. And I think that's a very family-friendly way of really going into these issues. And the last thing I'll say is, again, I think that as much as we need the technology companies to change because they really are shaping society, I'm not sure how fast that's going to happen. And so that's why I genuinely think that kind of a cultural awakening that's happening through this film is really the top thing I'm most excited and hopeful about. And the number of people, again, that are messaging me from around the world, and I'm sure messaging everybody else, it's really inspiring for the first time I've seen in a long time.
I think I would just add that I hope that people use the film as a launch pad to dig deeper, because it's a feature-length film, so we can't cover every single problem that this topic deals with. But I do think it provides a great introduction to digging deeper on a lot of these issues. And I even know I've had tons of friends reach out being like, what should I read next? Knowing that I have a library at home of every single topic we discuss. And I think that type of critical engagement with maybe just even 2 of the issues discussed in this film would really help us move along as a society.
Just to add to that, yeah, there's lots of resources available on the Social Dilemma website, our website as well, humanetech.com. We have many resources for people who want to get more engaged in solving these problems. There's also a podcast called Your Undivided Attention that has actually just shot to the #1 tech podcast in the last 5 days in Apple Podcasts, where people can really dig deeper into each of the issues. In fact, we've actually had Renee and Guillaume Chaslo, the YouTube recommendations engineer in the film, and Maria Ressa, who's featured in the film, talking about Facebook's effect on democracy in the Philippines. And it's really, any of these sources are great places to go deeper. And I definitely agree with Rashida that people should educate themselves.
I want to turn to some questions we got from viewers. I really like this first one. What gives you hope that social media can become a force for good?
Ooh. Who wants to jump in?
Positivity, guys.
This might seem odd, but there's a new social media app called Clubhouse that is actually giving me quite a bit of hope. It is built with a seemingly completely different model. It is people having conversations. I think it's still in beta. I don't know the full scoop there, but it is a platform where it's not about likes and hearts and all of that. It's a handful of people having intimate conversation with each other with a bunch of people listening in. So I bring that up as an example because the thing that gives me the most hope is actually new platforms, new technologists, new design. I don't know if these systems can be fixed from the inside or if we need something else to completely replace them that is just better, something that makes us feel better after we're done using them, something that makes us feel more informed, more educated, more grounded, as opposed to fractured and confused. So I would encourage, like, if there are technologists out there that want to go into tech, by all means, go into tech and build a better system that can replace the platforms that we have and replace these business models.
I know that today and in the film, we harp on a lot of the negatives, and it's important because social media companies are only advertising the positives of their platforms. But I do want to highlight that they have been beneficial in mobilizing and organizing. And I think we've seen a lot of that this year with a lot of the uprisings around racial justice. I don't want that to be minimized because it is, as much as it's a problematic communication technology, it has allowed people to connect and sort of amplify their messages in important ways.
I wanted to ask a question that we got from quite a few people. There were students that wrote us that said that as a student, they want to know how to support the movement for more humane technology. And they asked what kind of career paths lead to work in ethical and humane tech. Just building on that question a little bit, students that want to start a career in tech but don't want to work for a company or contribute to a project that is unethical, how would you guide them?
It's a hard one. I think we're at the beginning of a transformation of our technology environment. I mean, Jeff and I often have used this metaphor of, it's almost like we're moving from the oil-based economy to a regenerative energy-based economy. So our entire economy was built on an extractive model, in this case in technology, extracting not oil, but extracting attention out of human bodies and monetizing that. And it generated enormous wealth and enormous possibilities and enormous transformations in society, just like we want to thank oil for that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And also, because of climate change, we have to actually transition completely into this new regenerative model. So similar to that, let's thank what we got for how it served us, and let's move to models that are not extractive on manipulating human behavior. We're the product in something else. And then unfortunately for the students, there's not that many examples. I actually encourage people to, if you're interviewing at the big existing tech companies, to pose really challenging questions to them. I think about the K-pop stars who organized on TikTok. How do we actually organize all the people who are being recruited into some of the large tech companies to similarly pose challenging questions to them about how people are the product and what they think and what they're doing to answer the problems posed, maybe in the film. I think we're at the beginning of a fledgling movement and community. And it's going to take some time to fund, hopefully, those better alternatives. But I really would hope that people can become, the new, not Mark Zuckerberg's, but Marsha. I don't even know. I was going to make a joke about Marsha Zuckerberg or something. But a more diverse and interesting new community of people who are thinking differently about people's needs and really correcting for the problems. And unfortunately, again, there aren't existing companies that are really doing that. There's not that many of them.
Can I add something? No, I'm not a technologist. I think one of the problems that I've been noting a lot this year is that we often don't take the time to imagine the society that we want, and then what is the role of technology in advancing that. And I think we're seeing that at scale with a lot of these companies of like, they're just creating solutions that no one asked for, or that aren't meant for everyone. So I think if I was speaking to a younger self who wanted to be a technologist rather than a lawyer, I would do that imaginative work right now while you're seeing a world that's undergoing a lot of structural changes and need even more to think through what is it that you want, what is the vision of an equitable and fair society, and then what is the type of technology you want to use to advance that.
Just to piggyback on that, Rashida, there were two quotes that we had gotten from different interviews in the film that never made it into the final cut. One of which was, Silicon Valley solves Silicon Valley's problems. And another one was that the engineers often think, how can we build this thing rather than why should we build this thing? And just as you were saying, I think we need to be asking a completely different set of questions at the genesis of these products, at the genesis of these ideas. I also recognize, like, Twitter was started as an art project, right? They never had the expectation that it would grow to the scale that it did, nor Facebook, nor YouTube, et cetera. I think they were all blown away by how big they've gotten. But now that we recognize that these platforms can get this big, the responsibility of what do you do when you're interacting with multiple billion people, like, that has to be built into the genesis of these ideas and to these platforms. And we need to take society's frailties into account as we're designing them.
There's a joke that's told sometimes in Silicon Valley that it is a community dedicated to solving all the problems of a 30-year-old middle-class white male. And that's a joke. I moved out here, and then I went and interviewed people that worked at these companies as a non-white female. And I realized that it was quite reflective of the community of people that actually worked at some of Silicon Valley's biggest companies, which actually segues quite nicely to another question we've gotten, which is that the film briefly mentions that most of the people who have made tech what it is today are youngish white guys. No one is evil or deliberately programming things, but to what extent do you believe that technology can be racist, sexist, classist, etc.? How has AI produced biased outcomes, not just in the cyber world, but in the physical world as well?
So I'll take it. Part of the problem is that a lot of these technologies are amplifying the social inequities that already exist in society. And then when you're having what are really world-shaping technologies being made by such a tiny minority and a very homogenous one at that, then you're having technologies that are not made for everyone in mind. And that leads to what's this term that was coined by the sociologist Forrest Stewart from Stanford. It leads to digital disadvantage, in that the qualitative sort of differences in use and consequences very much align with where you sit in society's hierarchies, whether it's social, political, economic. And that means that not everyone is getting the same benefits, and there's greater stakes for some communities, in that it provides for being hyper visible, whether to the police or to people that want to market you predatory goods. And I think part of the problem is that these technology, who's both deciding what these technologies are being made for, who they're being made for, and the problems they're choosing to solve are not ones that are being decided by the sort of diverse demographics that we have in this country and even in this world, but such a limited few. And you see that amplified. It could be a whole documentary in itself just focusing on this question, so I can't go into sort of how it produces in each algorithm. But at scale, that's generally why we're seeing so many sort of disparate harms that stem from the uses of these technologies.
Great.
Just to add
there is
one
a
thing
film on this called Coded Bias. So I would recommend watching Coded Bias, which is much more specifically about this.
We just have a moment left before we have to close this discussion, unfortunately. And I just wanted to give thanks to all of our panelists for being with us today. Thank you so much for the movie, Jeff. I think you did a really interesting job in raising questions about the use of technology in all of our lives, and the way in which, the question of whether some of these addictive qualities aren't built into them. If you have not watched the film, it is on Netflix. I encourage you to do so. And thank you again, all of you, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.